Okay, welcome everyone to another edition of our play series. This is the last play in our cycle of seven that we're doing, and we will probably do another 7 plays after this. We'll see how it goes based on your feedback, of course, and your enjoyment, whether you like it or hate it. Tonight we're doing George Bernard Shaw's Saint Joan, and I am really looking forward to the discussion today because, number one, it's a very enjoyable play to go through, and secondly, of course, it touches on all kinds of issues that are extremely current to our situation today. So like I said, I'm really looking forward to your insights and the different ways you read the play, and how, whatever touched you, whatever you thought was important. For me, I have a couple of impressions that I want to share with you as from an outset. First one was how well this play fits with some of the other works that we've gone through, and I'm always looking to identify trends and ideas and insights that keep recurring. So as a reminder, last time we did Henrik Ibsen's Enemy of the People, and then before that we did Schiller's Don Carlos. Yes, I'm sorry, that's right. We are going to do Cyrano de Bergerac. For some reason, wasn't in the original plays that Shrikant mentioned, but yes, we're doing that as well. Thank you, Ernest. So anyway, but just let's just look and see, try to see how this play really fits in a lot of the themes that we've already covered with some of the earlier plays that we did, even going all the way back to Antigone, and this idea of personal freedom versus kind of the needs of society and state. In other words, individual versus some sort of community, if you will. And this seems to be a recurring theme, and it's because it's obviously something that we're still trying to figure out today, and we haven't figured it out completely. And this idea of this tug of war between the needs and interests of society as a whole, maybe interests of the majority, right, the compact majority, as we saw in Henrik Ibsen's Enemy of the People, versus this idea of individual freedom and individual freedom of conscience and freedom of action and belief. And this obviously comes out in Saint Joan. Saint Joan is, again, a revolutionary type character that steps out of the norms in so many ways, right? As norms of what it means to be a woman, norms of what it means to be a Catholic, Catholic, right? So she challenges a lot of the orthodoxy of Christian church, the dogma that most people have received and have followed. She challenges the ideas of what it means to go to battle, and Shaw is really, I have to say, I really enjoyed reading that preface before the play, because it really sets up all the various ways you can look at this play and it's Joan of Arc in specifically from so many angles, and he tries to explore it. And I think he does a really good job at being, presenting a non-biased, or as much as possible, I guess, a non-biased version of who she really was. And he presents also historically how she has been represented, and sometimes more more generously than at other times. So we have various representations of her in literature, and historically, the facts are pretty straightforward. There's not really a lot of debate on what happened. Now, the debate is, of course, on how we interpret what happened. Just as a reminder, of course, St. Joan was a peasant, or maybe a lower middle class type character in medieval, or I guess it was 15th century. I guess not medieval anymore. It's more like Renaissance France, and France is in the middle of a war with England, The English have already invaded parts of France, and they're losing. The French rather are losing to the English, and then this person sort of appears out of the mass of the people, emerges this character, Joan of Arc, and it's uncanny how a lot of times when you have a crisis, these characters just sort of emerge out of the kind of the unnamed mass of people, and they become heroes, just tremendous leaders of the people. And then initially, of course, she gains a lot of popularity, and then she is betrayed by her own, by the French, and then sold to the British, condemned, judged, burned to the stake. All this happens very quickly. She is only 19 or around that when she's burned at the stake. So she's a very young girl. And then maybe let me see what my notes say. I think it's literally maybe 10 years or after I think it was maybe 20 years later, she is rehabilitated. So in other words, they have a retrial of the trial, and they decide that no, they were all wrong. Of course, too late. Now she's dead, so we can do whatever. We can rewrite history. But she is now she is cleared of all the charges of heresy and so on. And of course, the reason for that is also somewhat political, because if she's not rehabilitated, then the coronation that she presided over, the coronation of is it Charles?
King Charles VII.
Yeah, Charles is invalid and dubious and not authoritative anymore. So obviously they have to do something to retroactively rewrite the history. So anyway, it's just a very interesting historical event, but also how Shaw interprets it in the larger context, and the themes that are touched on are, really, he really does a fantastic job. And also it's very enjoyable to read, as I mentioned, because of all the humor, the sarcasm, the irony that's present throughout the play. We're dealing with people in the court and also common people, and Joan is portrayed as this really shrewd, kind of naive but very shrewd personality, and she really knows how to challenge the even the most astute of her prosecutors, and she's just a really an amazing person based on that depiction of Shaw. So anyway, those are some of my initial notes on kind of the context and the import of the play. Now, I guess I want to just break for just a second and see if you guys have any kind of opening remarks on this of your own that maybe you thought was something that it was salient and really like primary to you as you were reading it. So if you have a comment, feel free to raise your hand or type an exclamation mark in the chat, and I will give you a chance to say. Ernest, go ahead.
Very important to notice also that all the proceedings of the trial and the second trial were recorded, and we have these records of them. So it wasn't a show's imagination. Obviously, it's not exactly 100% up to historical records, but we have historical records of the proceeding. And obviously, it was important for us not only to show historical record, but what I like about this play is that he has an epilogue, and he transposed this epilogue into our time and what happened in 1920 when she became a saint and performed miracles, and it was recorded. And what's the reaction of the people in our time if they want to have her as a live person, and they rejected that. And that's a genius of George Bernard Shaw. He, by showing this epilogue and how would people react in our time. And that's very important. And it's also very sarcastic, the way he did it.
Thank you. Katie, go ahead.
I think I had read another book in a different meetup, And I think also this time, like nowadays, if you were to hear somebody say voices, you might you probably think it was imagination, but that back then they would tend to kind of view it as either, like you were either possessed by, the devil or, divine, so they had a much broader sense, or even someone who was crazy at the time, they might think that those voices that they were hearing they were inspired by the divine, versus now we might think that might be either their own imagination or possibly pathological.
Mm-hmm. Who was it? An American psychologist, was it William James, who had a whole study on religious experiences? There's a book, I think, by him. He did like a seminal study of all the different religious experiences from a psychological standpoint. And he wasn't at all, critical or saying it's valid or invalid. He just wanted to, kind of catalog it and say, this is what people experience. This is part of human experience, religion, a religious experience, whether it's in prayer or having a vision or hearing a voice. But, this is, Katie, thank you for bringing this up, because I wanted to, one of the things that struck me as I was reading this was Joan's remark when she is challenged about those voices. And someone says, it's just your imagination. And she says, that's how God speaks to us, in our imagination. So this is the genius of how do you respond to that? You can't really, say, well, I guess, because that's exactly right. When we have a dream, who is there to say what is the source of that, right? I guess you can have a scientific explanation for it, but there's not really an experiment you can easily perform that will say one way or another. And whatever reading you might have, there's always a natural explanation, and then there is sort of like a mystical explanation. But this idea that imagination is how we perceive the divine, I thought that was brilliant, because I think that goes with kind of a lot of the themes that we've been discussing about mythology, right? That's why we read. And that's why we enjoy literature in general, because of imagination. And there's something, I don't want to say supernatural, but there's definitely something above the ordinary experience in literature, in poetry, that we crave, and it's there for us. And this idea that, imagination is how we get in touch with the divine. I thought that was, if there's nothing else I'm going to take away from this play, I think this will be one insight that I'm going to take away with me after reading this. So, Katie, thank you for bringing this up. Anyone else who wants to contribute before we dive into other points? Ernest, did you want to say something, or you're on mute? Oh, okay, never mind. So I want to share with you also another lens that I have for how I was approaching this, and I guess looking at some of the themes in St. Joan. And it is a lens of Dostoevsky, specifically Brothers Karamazov, and the scene of the Grand Inquisitor. I think it's a fitting comparison, because of course we are faced with Inquisition here, and a kind of an Inquisition type, well, not just type, but specifically an Inquisition trial of Joan. She's tried as a religious heretic, so it's a religious trial. And in Brothers Karamazov, we have the story that's written by one of the brothers, Ivan, and he recounts this imaginary return of Christ to medieval Spain, and how he thinks that if Christ were to return to medieval Spain, he would be arrested and executed. And but it's not so much that he's executed; it's the reasons that the Grand Inquisitor, gives for his execution, and those reasons really synchronize in my mind with the reasons that Joan is arrested for. And one of the reasons is that Christ is, by the fact that he is inviting people to have their own freedom of conscience and their own freedom of belief, and freedom to follow God in the way they see fit, it really undermines the authority of the church, and it undermines the authority of the state, because church is tied to the state. And so when Saint Joan started claiming that she has this direct intercourse with God, and she has, a direct line to God, that obviously could not go unchallenged from two powerful institutions of the time. One is the aristocracy and royalty, and the second is the church, which wielded almost as much power as the state at that point. And we see it in the trial. We see the trial being kind of oscillating between these two poles of power. One is the power of the state, and the other the power of the church. And on one side, she's being condemned as a heretic, but on the other side, there are players in that court that want her to be condemned and killed, or at least imprisoned, regardless of her beliefs. They don't care about whether or not she recants from her beliefs that are heretical. They want her gone because she challenges their authority. And so this is kind of the underlying theme in St. Joan, is what are the limitations of this individual freedom? Are the leaders of the church in some ways justified in confining her and limiting her influence at least? And then, unfortunately, when she refuses to recant because she refuses to be imprisoned for life, they say, well, I guess then we have to burn you, we have to kill you. And so again, it's this idea of the limits of individual freedom versus the collective good, if you will. And Shaw, in his preface, he says that the actions that were taken in his mind are unjustified, and a person who tries to justify them can justify pretty much anything. I'm curious if you agree with Shaw in that regard. I'm personally, I'm not so sure. And we've kind of seen the limits of individual freedom during the pandemic. I hate to kind of make it more political in a sense, but we do see that there is some need to draw a line and to say, okay, well, this is, if you want to live in society, you have to follow the rules of society at some point. And at the same time, it's a very dangerous path, and it leads to totalitarianism and so on. And we've seen kind of it's a very fine line. I keep referring back to the razor's edge that we're walking on today in society, because we constantly are trying to keep our balance and not fall into either totalitarianism on one side and then dangerous erroneous influences that destroy society in the end, tear society apart. So you have to tread that fine line. And going back to Brothers Karamazov, the whole reason why the Grand Inquisitor says he's going to crucify Christ is because he thinks that people do not really want freedom; they want happiness, not freedom per se. And that's a really deep point that also just cuts to the core of this question. What is the ultimate objective, right, that we're trying to, is it happiness, is it freedom, is it some sort of morality or justice? What is the kind of the end all that trumps everything else? And so these are the questions that I think that St. Joan really highlights. So yeah, any feedback, or if you have any other points that you want to make, feel free to type an exclamation point or raise your hand. I know there's only a few of us here, so I don't want to dominate the conversation. So if you have anything to add, feel free. Otherwise, I just want to point out the idea of Catholic Church in the play. And this idea that you have this kind of universal organization that claims allegiance from pretty much everyone in Europe, right? You have the kind of the Christendom, right, of the Western Europe, and it sort of spreads or envelops everyone. And at the same time, so you have this universal blanket that sort of covers everything. And at the same time, Joan comes out and says, well, that's fine, but yet we have another factor that contends with this, and this is the idea that God has set boundaries for nations, and the English are to live in England and the French are to live in France. And so if someone essentially violates these boundaries, then we have kind of a blank check from God to resist and to kill the English. Otherwise, killing them would be a sin, right? It would be murder. So again, it's this idea of nationalism versus universalism. And to what degree is she right? I mean, she is a staunch nationalist. She wants the French to live in France, the English to live in England, and those boundaries are to be maintained and enforced. And today we kind of have the same. I want to say we have the same predicament where on one side we have nationalism, right, and we tend to condemn that today. It's interesting. Historically, nationalism was something that was very praiseworthy, right? And we've had unification of Italy and unification of Germany and all these things that were very nationalistic in their sort of mindset. But today we're very wary of these tendencies because we've seen how they can also go too far and produce intolerance and xenophobia and so on. And yet here's Joan, and Joan is she's challenging all these norms. Katie, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think it was both. For Germany, for example, I think that the first move towards all the different states that all kind of roughly spoke German and unifying that into a state, I don't think that was viewed negatively. But then later on in European history, we see that it can take a different turn. But I think also like even something like even Jesus himself wanted to free Jews from Roman occupation. So I'm not sure whether there's a conflict between not having other. Yeah, I'm not sure. Is it a conflict if another people is ruling over, whether that's a conflict?
Yeah, I actually I'm not sure if Jesus really wanted to free the Jews from Roman authority. If you remember, famously, when the tax collector approaches him, he says, "Give to Caesar, render to Caesar what is Caesar's," right? Render unto Caesar what is due. So he doesn't really call for like an insurrection. And in fact, at that time, there were a lot of groups that wanted to stir a violent revolt against the Romans. And in 70 AD, they succeeded, and there was a huge revolt that ended in this huge tragedy of Jerusalem was surrounded and sieged and eventually destroyed, and the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. So that happened way after Jesus's death. So he tended to, I think, direct his attention more to the kingdom of God, which is within rather than without, right? And today we tend to try to politicize some of the messages that he preached. And again, that's the conflict, because if you have somebody who has kind of this absolute claim on what it means to live a certain way, right, that transcends political boundaries or limitations, transcends pretty much anything and everything, that's a dangerous person for society, because they think of themselves as above society. And Joan definitely puts herself in that place. If you remember, she starts to contradict the king, she starts to contradict the archbishop. She's pretty much outside of any kind of boundaries. And of course, if it was anyone else, we would challenge that, right? We would say, well, like, we can't have everybody claiming they have direct voices of God, because that would be kind of chaotic, right? How do we know, God told us to do this, God, and we've seen, in real life, we've seen a lot of people that are fanatics, and they do all kinds of crazy things. Now, Shaw actually addresses this, and I'm not sure if I agree with him, but his point is the following. He says, we can judge whether or not Joan was right or wrong in her assertions by the types of things that God commanded her to do. So in other words, he says, it's not the methods, it's the results. So you can judge the fruit, judge the tree by its fruit. I'm not so sure I agree with that. But anyway, that's his point. And he says, what she did was, she was very shrewd, and whatever you believe about the voices that she heard, everything that those voices told her was could have been derived from very shrewd common sense. And the fact that here she is, a young, uneducated peasant, essentially a peasant girl from like the middle of nowhere, right? She is not from Paris. She's not from any kind of aristocratic background. She's, again, completely unlearned, completely naive, and so on. And yet she is able to see through to kind of the core issues and realize, number one, that we need to crown Charles as king. Otherwise, he doesn't have authority. He doesn't have a unifying influence. So she goes straight for that. And then, of course, some of the victories that she directs and helps achieve is another issue. And then, she's just shrewd at every turn. And so Shaw says, look, don't worry about whether or not the voices were real or whatnot. The methodology doesn't matter, it's the results. I actually, like I said, I don't necessarily agree with that, because I think if you have the wrong methodology, you are giving a blank check. So today the results are okay, but tomorrow the results are going to be horrendous if you validate this idea that anybody can just come in and follow the voices that he hears in his head. There has to be something else. There has to be some other kind of guidelines or limits or something along those lines. So what do you guys think about that? Peggy, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to comment on her shrewdness. Mm-hmm. I read in another source that she didn't fight. I guess she carried the flag, but she did all the strategies for the war. She put all that together. Mm-hmm. So not all of it, but I think she was probably the leader. So I thought that was really interesting.
And what do you guys think about her? One of the points that she was challenged on, and in fact, they were going to bring it up as one of the points against her in the trial, was the fact that she was wearing a soldier's clothing. And she said, well, I am with the soldiers, and I don't want them to look at me as a woman. I want them to look at me as a fellow soldier. And if I was wearing a skirt, then most likely, they would look at me as a woman, and it would be a mess. Which everybody, Shaw including, thinks that was a very shrewd move as well. Because if she was, her wearing the soldier's attire made her indistinguishable to other soldiers. They looked at her as a comrade in arms, not as a, some girl to have romance with, or something like that. So it was just a really shrewd move. But in her explanation was, of course, that was just another voice that she heard and directed her to do that. So it's almost like I'm wondering if it was almost like tongue in cheek when she says that she's hearing these voices. In some ways, it's just like her common sense, her shrewdness, her uncanny ability to kind of see the optimal solution, if you will. So I'm curious if you guys think about that, or what you think about that, rather. So yeah, I thought that was very, very to the point. So let's see. Oh yeah, so another point that comes out in the play is this idea of intolerance, right? And intolerance meaning toleration towards other viewpoints. And during the trial, Joan is constantly challenged to accept the orthodoxy that the church is the only body that can interpret scripture and the only body that can tell you really like what God wants from you. And she challenges that. And she says, no, if it's not my own head, who else, like, how am I going to know what to do if it's not like my own mind that tells me what to do? In other words, she refuses to give up her autonomy to make the final determination of what it is that God wants her to do. This is a very modern and revolutionary idea, and we know that it did not end well for people at that time when they tried to follow that idea. We know another story of Jan Hus and the Hussites. Jan Hus was a Czech reformer who was also burned at the stake precisely for the same kind of notions of insisting that everyone has their own sort of freedom of conscience and freedom of belief to interpret the scripture as they will. And all of these ideas ultimately culminated 100 years later in Martin Luther's famous 95 Theses and the birth of Protestant movement that split the church from the single unit that it was, the Catholic Church, into Protestantism and Catholicism. Of course, earlier there was the schism with the West versus the East, but speaking of Western Christianity, it was a pretty unified movement. And but then it really split, and the issue that was at stake was exactly this idea of who gets to interpret and arbitrate the truth, and whether it's just sort of like a social institution or whether it's individual. And Protestantism claimed that it was individual, and the Catholics still claim that it is up to kind of the church as a body with the Pope at its head to determine what is right and what is wrong, essentially. So this is very pertinent at the time. It also is pertinent to us today, I think. Oh yeah, Katie, thank you for saying that she challenged the feudal system. Yeah, that was another sticky point that Joan basically, undermined the authority of the aristocracy, right? So she goes out there, bypasses her other, all the other leaders, and goes directly to the king. And the king, and she essentially, I guess the question is, how does she challenge the feudal system? Well, the idea was as follows. If the king basically starts ruling based on this idea that God has appointed him, in other words, he has absolute rule, then he doesn't need the aristocrats, the feudal leaders to sort of support him. He gets the support directly from God, and he has sort of the absolute sway to determine what to do, as opposed to this balance of power that has evolved in the feudal system, where the kings really did not have absolute authority. They really relied and were dependent on the aristocracy to support them. And so there was this balance of power. But Joan essentially goes to Charles and says, look, you have to follow God directly, give up the country to God, and then you have absolute rule, basically, because you're following God, and therefore you have a kind of a blank check, just like she does. And that undermined that system, the feudal system, because it's no longer checks and balances. It's no longer king has some authority, and then the aristocrats have authority within their spheres, and they're all kind of divvying it up. This is like, okay, the king has now absolute rule. And by the way, it seems that Joan's philosophy of politics, it seems to have won the day. ultimately, because 100 years later, we have, like I mentioned, we have Protestantism come on the scene, but we also have the rise of these absolute monarchs, right? Like Louis the 14th, the Sun King, who have absolute rule, and it seems that the power of the king, the centralized power, is on the rise, and the power of the aristocracy really wanes until we have further developments, and then the monarchies are displaced with a different form of government. But for the time being, it seems that Joan's viewpoint seems to be winning the day, at least kind of the trajectory of that. So, Katie, did that was that explanation? Did that make sense?
Yeah, because she's saying that the king is responsible to God, and she's saying, well, God told me this. So she's coming in with, and then kind of, I can see that now in the struggle, kind of in the struggle of the individual versus the Catholic Church then, because then why wouldn't any individual be able to claim divine inspiration?
Right. And I guess too that I guess historically speaking, when you have like a despot, the despot always relies directly on the people. He doesn't rely on his counselors, the kind of the court, or the people that are surrounding him, that are vested with him in power. He is typically relying on the people, and so that I don't want to say middle class, but that class of the aristocratic class is bypassed in that sense. Just like if you remember with Julius Caesar, the layer of society that lost its power was the Senate when he came to power, because he relied directly on the army and the people, and the senators who wielded enormous power until then, or while Rome was a republic, they lost a lot of that power. And so with Rome becoming an empire and being ruled by a single ruler, that was the class that lost its power. So as the power of the king increases, the power of the aristocracy necessarily has to decrease. And so Joan, when she proclaims and kind of anoints almost Charles as king, what she's doing is increasing his power, his prestige, and his influence. And who is losing from that? Well, it's the people that are closest to him, people that are trying to control him at the level of his courtiers and the aristocracy. And so they're not happy with Joan at all because of what she's doing. They want the king to rely on them as the ones that prop him up. And in the very beginning, when you read the play, that's what's happening. Charles he's portrayed as very weak. He tries to contradict the archbishop. He tries to contradict, who's that guy? He's talking to their, not Cochon, the other guy, Latremoille, yeah. So, and if you remember, when Joan appears at the court, she sees this one lady, and she says, "Is this the queen?" And they say, "No, it's not the queen." She thinks that she's the queen, but she's not. That's Latremoille's wife. So Latremoille is the guy who essentially holds King hostage because he's lending him a lot of money. And so the crown is kind of indebted to the king. The crown is indebted to these aristocrats and the church because they lend money and influence to him. And so Joan finds herself in between these poles of power, and she chooses to go with the king because in her mind, and again, it's kind of like, I guess maybe her simplicity, she thinks of the Old Testament where you don't have aristocracy, you have God, and then right underneath that, you have king like David or Solomon or somebody like that. And she's like a prophet. And I think in the preface, Shaw quotes a letter that he received from one of the Catholic clergymen who says, in society, you have to have a balance between these three three currents of power: religion, or religious power, state power, and what he calls the prophets. Prophets being kind of like the voice of the people. And Joan, of course, is that voice. She is the prophetess. Prophets, of course, if you remember in the Old Testament, were the ones that also had that voice from God, right? So she is, she fits that role perfectly. She is the prophetess that comes in with the message from on high, and then starts saying, okay, God told me this, God told me that. And then it's somewhat, in some ways, it's presented as somewhat funny and comedic to people that are also common sense. They challenge it. They say, well, she's crazy. She's just nuts. But then they hear what she has to say and they change their mind. And that's I guess Shaw's argument, that it doesn't really matter how she got her message. What matters is the message made sense, and people followed it. So, yeah. So that's that. I also want to read a quick note from, I hope you guys had a chance to read the preface, George Bernard Shaw's preface to the play, because again, it's just really, really good and really easy to read and follow. He makes all kinds of great points there. And one of the points that he makes that that comes out, there's several. One, he says, we tend to look at this historical event and focus on the cruelty of Joan's Joan of Arc's demise, right? The burning. But he said people were burned all the time. It wasn't an uncommon thing, just like people were crucified in Jesus's time all the time, and it wasn't an uncommon thing. So it wasn't like unusual or cruel for them at that time. It was a common event. And just like I mentioned, they burned Jan Hus, they burned Giordano Bruno. I mean, it was a common way of disposing of criminals, or specifically heretics. So it's not that. And it said, and he also makes a claim, Bernard Shaw, that is, that the cruelty of today's system is not any less cruel than it was back then. And so, yes, it was cruel, but it was over, and it was short, and it was kind of, it had a definite ending. But today we incarcerate people, and the kind of experience they go through in jail is much more barbaric and inhuman in a lot of ways than it was back then. Katie, go ahead.
Yeah, another point that I was seeing made in someone's analysis of it was that it was like, you're saying it's a tragedy without villains. Like that she thought she was, she generally thought those were voices from God. And sorry, the point's kind of slipping my mind, but I could, rather than viewing them as just people that got rid of, I guess I'm having a hard time formulating my question, but because I kind of would see the people that killed her as villains, but they were trying to make the point like they both saw themselves as right. That was what
yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. And I think that's George Bernard Shaw's point in the preface, is that we shouldn't look at the people who were orchestrating the trial as evil or villainous. They weren't. That's the whole point. That's why I was bringing up Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, because that's the whole point of the Grand Inquisitor. He himself, when he condemns Christ to be crucified again, he is not being villainous. He says that's for the good of the people. He tells Christ that you don't care about the people, we do, because you only want kind of the elect, the few that can follow you, the few that can renounce their possessions and do all the stuff that you tell them. But most people cannot do that, and they will never be able to do that, and they will never be able to deal with the freedom and the choice that you give them. They're just not built that way. Most people, they want to follow directions and instructions, and we're going to provide that. And if you're coming in and thinking that you're going to do all this and undo our influence, to the stake you go, to the cross you go. And the same applies to St. Joan's trial. when the Archbishop and is it Archbishop Couchon? Yeah, when Couchon and some of the other inquisitors are formulating the trial and the questions, they really do think that Joan's influence is detrimental to everything, and it's going to undermine kind of the social order, and it's going to undermine the church's authority, and it's going to result in chaos, and it's just going to be bad. So they're not evil from their point of view. They are doing God's work. And to call them evil is, I mean, good or evil depends on what vantage point you're looking at, and that's probably the So it's a relativistic position depending on what you consider the ultimate good. So, and that's why I was trying to formulate it as, what do you consider the ultimate good? Do you consider the freedom of conscience and freedom of belief as something that you would put higher than, let's say, being happy or secure in your possessions or something like that? And some people would say, no, I care about security, and that's first. Kind of like the Maslow's pyramid of needs, right? I want that first, and if I don't get that, I don't care about anything else. And that's kind of, I think, the position of the church there, that they want people to be secure and safe, and for that they need the church to have the authority. And if that's challenged, then everything else is going to go to hell, and literally and physically. So that's the I think so. Yeah, I don't know, Katie, does that make sense? As far as
they're maintaining the order.
Yeah, they're maintaining the order, and we've seen this. This is where I feel like this is such a great addition to some of the earlier plays, because you see the same thing happening in Don Carlos, and the same thing happening in Ibsen, and the same thing happening in Antigone, right? So all of these plays, you have a situation where you have somebody going outside the state prescribed lines. In Antigone, it's Antigone who says, I'm not going to obey the edict of the king not to bury my brother. I'm going to bury him, regardless of what you say. And of course, we see what happens after that. She pays the price, and we've kind of, and there were some people, I think, during the discussion there who said, well, maybe she was a little too arrogant. And we can definitely say the same thing about Joan. In fact, that's what she is most often vilified as being arrogant and proud, and she probably is to a degree, and she doesn't understand it. She doesn't see herself as being arrogant because she's so sure of her voices and so on. But from a kind of external viewpoint, if somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I have a voice from God, and not only does it tell me to do something, it's telling you to do something. I mean, how would you react to that? I mean, it would be a little off-putting, I think. And I've seen people like that, by the way. I've met people that say things like that, and they believe wholeheartedly that that's what they have some vision or some voice, and it makes for a very tense social interaction when everybody's so sure of themselves. So there's definitely something to be said for both sides of that story. Yeah. I do want to read, if no one else has another comment, I want to read a short excerpt from George Bernard Shaw's preface to the play under the heading Credulity, Modern and Medieval. And he talks about how, back in those days, the church had kind of the ultimate say in what is true and what is not true. But today it's someone else. And he says, today, when the doctor has succeeded to the priest and can do practically what he likes with Parliament and the press through the blind faith in him, which has succeeded to the far more critical faith in the parson, legal compulsion to take the doctor's prescription, however poisonous, is carried to an extent that would have horrified the Inquisition and staggered Archbishop Laud. So, and then he says, our credulity is grosser than that of the Middle Ages, because the priest had no such direct pecuniary interest in our sins as the doctor has in our diseases. He did not starve when all was well with his flock, nor prosper when they were perishing, as our private commercial doctors must. I thought, this is very apropos. We just went through the pandemic, and there were all these questions about the conflict of interest, right, of the big pharma companies that provided the vaccines, and whether or not, whatever side of that debate you are on, you can't deny the fact that there is definitely some very dubious position that we're in the sense that we have as a society promulgated the kind of the scientific community and the medical community, who are supported on one side by government grants and on the other side by the corporations that they're embedded in. And the public interest and the private interest are definitely at odds, or could be at odds at least. And so the kind of credulity that we give to the medical associations and so on, all these bodies that that regulate us, for better or for worse, is in George Bernard Shaw's opinion, much more broad and much more pervasive than the church ever had. So I thought that was a very interesting point that he makes. And of course, this was in 1920s. I forget when I think it was after the Spanish flu. So maybe it had something to do with that as well, when they had the Spanish flu. And, it was also, I think, one of the first times when they had a situation where the world kind of was shut down because of this event. Anyway, curious what you guys think about that, the kind of the limitations and of power for one organization that acts as a kind of the director for all of society, right? And we tend to today, unfortunately we've centralized that these positions of power. And I agree with George Bernard Shaw. I think it's far more, these positions are far more pervasive and invasive than the church ever was in those times, because they were challenged all the time, and it wasn't as smooth sailing as some of us might think for the church. There was always some kind of controversy, and somebody was challenging the church's edicts. Although I have to say that even today we challenge the official party line, so I guess that's good. Eleanor, do you have any thoughts or opinions on the matter, or anything you would like to share with us? I want to make sure we include you in the conversation as well.
Oh,
pressure. You don't have to say.
Absolutely included. I appreciate you doing this amazing, great job, and I love listening.
Okay. Okay, great. No worries. No worries. All right. Oh yeah, so this is another interesting comparison that Shaw draws in the preface with St. Joan, and that is a comparison of her to Socrates and the role of what he calls a genius in society, right? So Socrates famously was also tried, and he had a choice whether to leave Athens or to take the hemlock, and he chose to take the hemlock. In some ways, it's almost like the choice that Joan was facing, whether to recant and to be imprisoned for life, or not to recant and be burned at the stake. And both of them chose the more extreme version of the punishment because they considered, I guess, the allegiance to truth and allegiance maybe to life as something that was more important to them than physical, the fear of physical death or torture even. And in general, this idea that you have these individuals that are in some ways above the rest of us, have exceptional ability, exceptional visionary power, What do we do with them? And are they always unjustly treated? And why are they unjustly treated? And what are the kind of the motives behind it? Is it jealousy? Is it some sort of fear of those who are better than us? Or is it maybe our reluctance to accept that there are people that are better than us? I mean, we live in a very egalitarian, or at least society that tries to be egalitarian, and we put a high value on equality and equity and so on. But some people are possibly much more, capable, and what do we do with them? Do we give them some sort of elevated status and ability, or do we discount them? Katie, go ahead.
Well, I think some of it, because she's also called like the maid. I think some of it is because she's kind of a surprise that she comes out of this low class status. They didn't expect that to be coming from her.
Right, but at the same time, yeah. So she is definitely right. They're surprised. So I see what you're saying. So you're saying like they are, because she is of such low origin and low status, they're reluctant to give her more kind of more say in the affairs of the state, right? Than they are, they're all like educated and they've come from noble families and so on. Yeah, I can totally see that. I mean, that makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. Yeah.
Keep her place a little bit.
Yeah. No, that I mean, yeah, I think that's always the case, right? So you always have people that are in power, they're reluctant to share that power, or especially to admit a newcomer who has no pedigree whatsoever, except for the voices of God. But one thing that Joan has is this ability, this uncanny ability to win people over. And I think that serves her well for gives her this sort of trajectory, right? This inertia until the very end. She's able to really win people over to her cause and to her point of view. And it works starting from her father, who initially doesn't want to let her go, but then to the guy who's in charge of what's that thing? The castle there that she's in, and so on, Voldecourt, right? And then she keeps going all the way to the king, and then she convinces the king to do her bidding. I mean, it's amazing, right? This young girl who is in her teens is able to have this uncanny influence on the most powerful people in Europe. It's just really an amazing story. All right. Any other thoughts or final remarks on this? I don't really have a whole lot more to say unless you guys want to discuss something specific. All right, so I guess we'll be concluding then. If no one else has any additional remarks or comments, this will be a short meeting. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of people, and Ernest has left us. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this discussion. St. Joan, really great play, really enjoyable. I hope you enjoyed reading it and maybe rereading it. If you haven't had a chance to read the preface, I really highly recommend it. It's a great intro, both historically to the story and yes, thank you, Katie. And just the kind of the reception of the story, and then different portrayals of Joan, different aspects of her life, different opinions about her, how she was portrayed in plays, in literature, and so on. So as was mentioned earlier, we will be doing Cyrano de Bergerac in 2 weeks, and that will conclude our series, our cycle of plays. And then we'll hopefully, we'll restart We'll go back to the early Greek plays, and then we'll just keep going kind of in the cyclical manner until until we decide not to keep going, because there's so many great plays that we can do. We can do this for a long time, but we'll try to focus on the ones that are of most import, the most famous plays, and the ones from different periods, different writers. Try to kind of do a catch-all from different aspects. So, and see again, the focus of this series is we're trying to identify recurring themes in all of these themes that come up all the time. And I think so far we've already seen a lot of recurrence in this current series. So thanks everyone for joining, and we will see you in 2 weeks.